The 17th and 18th centuries were a wild time in history. Philosophers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau shook the foundations of society. People began to challenge traditional authority and question everything from the purpose of government to the nature of knowledge itself. What began as a philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment would soon spark revolutions across Europe and America, transforming our world forever. And while this era is often remembered for its emphasis on reason and individualism, there's much more to understand about what made it so revolutionary and how it laid the groundwork for the modern world. Welcome to the first episode of a new series called Revolutions. Now, if you've taken any world history courses, you probably know that the French Revolution was one of the most significant events in European history. It was a time of great upheaval and change when the people of France overthrew their king and established a republic. But what led up to this revolution? Why were the French people so discontent with their king? And how did this revolution change the course of history? Well, before we can answer those questions, we need to understand the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that emphasized the use of reason to challenge traditional authority. It began in the early 17th century and lasted until the end of the 18th century. The Enlightenment was a reaction against the religious fundamentalism and superstition that had dominated European thought for centuries. Enlightenment thinkers believed that the world could be understood through reason and that human beings could use reason to improve themselves and society. This idea was revolutionary because it challenged the traditional view that humans were sinful creatures who should live in fear of God. Instead, Enlightenment thinkers argued that humans were rational beings who could make decisions about how to live their lives and how to govern themselves. One of the most important ideas of the Enlightenment was the concept of natural rights. Natural rights are rights that all humans have, simply by virtue of being human. They are not granted by any government or other authority, and they cannot be taken away by any government or other authority. John Locke, an English philosopher, argued that all humans have a right to life, liberty and property. These natural rights are given to us by God, and it is the government's job to protect them. If the government fails to protect these rights, then the people have a right to overthrow the government and establish a new one. This idea was a radical departure from the traditional view that the purpose of government was to maintain order and enforce the will of the ruler. Instead, Locke argued that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of the people, and if the government failed to do this, then it was the duty of the people to overthrow the government. Another important idea of the Enlightenment was the concept of separation of powers. This idea was developed by the French philosopher Montesquieu, who argued that the government should be divided into three branches: the executive, which enforces the laws, the legislative, which makes the laws, and the judicial, which interprets the laws. Each of these branches should be independent of the others, so that no one branch could become too powerful. This idea was also a radical departure from the traditional view that the ruler had absolute power. Instead, Montesquieu argued that the power of the ruler should be limited by the law. These ideas had a profound impact on the development of Western civilization. They inspired the American and French revolutions and the establishment of modern democracies. The ideas of the Enlightenment also had an impact on the development of scientific thought. Enlightenment thinkers believed that the world could be understood through reason and that human beings could use reason to improve themselves and society. This idea was a reaction against the religious fundamentalism and superstition that had dominated European thought for centuries. Instead, Enlightenment thinkers argued that the world could be understood through reason and that human beings could use reason to improve themselves and society. This emphasis on reason led to the development of new methods of scientific inquiry and the discovery of many new scientific principles. For example, Isaac Newton developed his laws of motion and universal gravitation, which had a profound impact on our understanding of the physical world. But why is the Enlightenment important to the story of the French Revolution? Well, remember how I said that the French people were unhappy with their king? Well, the Enlightenment helped to fuel this discontent. The ideas of the Enlightenment were spread throughout Europe by a group of people called the philosophers. The philosophers were a diverse group of intellectuals who shared a common commitment to using reason to challenge traditional authority. They wrote books, articles, and pamphlets that were widely read by the public, and they held salons where they discussed the latest ideas about politics, society, and science. One of the most famous salons was that of Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of the French king, Louis XV. Her salon was a gathering place for some of the leading philosophers of the time, including Voltaire and Diderot. Through these salons and other means, the ideas of the Enlightenment spread throughout Europe, and they had a profound impact on the French people. The French people were particularly receptive to the ideas of the Enlightenment because they were living under the rule of an absolute monarch. King Louis XVI was the absolute ruler of France, and he had complete control over the government. He was not accountable to the people, and he was not required to follow the law. This situation led to widespread discontent among the French people, especially among the members of the French nobility and the middle class. The French nobility was a hereditary class that had traditionally held great power and privilege in France. However, by the 18th century, their power and privilege had been greatly reduced. This led to a sense of resentment among the French nobility, who began to resent the king and the government. The French middle class, or bourgeoisie, was also unhappy with the king. They resented the fact that they were not allowed to participate in the government, and they chafed under the heavy taxes that Louis XVI had imposed on them. So when the ideas of the Enlightenment began to circulate in France, they found a receptive audience. The French people were eager to find new ways of thinking about politics, society, and the role of the government. The ideas of the Enlightenment appealed to the French people for several reasons. First, the ideas of the Enlightenment offered a new way of thinking about the role of the government. The French people were accustomed to living under the rule of an absolute monarch who had complete control over the government. But the ideas of the Enlightenment suggested that the power of the ruler should be limited by the law and that the people should have a say in the government. This was a radical idea that appealed to the French people, who were tired of being ruled by an absolute monarch. Second, the ideas of the Enlightenment offered a new way of thinking about society. The French Enlightenment thinkers, like Montesquieu and Rousseau, argued that society should be based on the ideas of equality and liberty. This was a radical idea that appealed to the French people, who were tired of living under the rigid rules of the French nobility. Finally, the ideas of the Enlightenment offered a new way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the world around them. The Enlightenment thinkers believed that the world could be understood through reason and that human beings could use reason to improve themselves and society. This was a radical idea that appealed to the French people, who were tired of living in a world that was governed by superstition and religion. So the ideas of the Enlightenment were very popular in France, and they played a major role in the French Revolution. You see, the French people were already unhappy with their king and the government, and the ideas of the Enlightenment only made things worse. The ideas of the Enlightenment made it clear to the French people that they were living in a corrupt and unjust society. They inspired the French people to take action to overthrow the government and establish a new society based on the principles of the Enlightenment. And so, in 1789, the French Revolution began. The French people stormed the Bastille, a symbol of the king's absolute power, and they established a republic based on the principles of the Enlightenment. The French Revolution was a watershed moment in world history. It was the first time that a nation of people had overthrown their government and established a republic based on the principles of democracy. The French Revolution had a profound impact on the course of history. It inspired other revolutions around the world, such as the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Wars of Independence. It also helped to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment throughout Europe and the rest of the world. However, the French Revolution was not without its problems. The revolution was marked by violence and instability, and it ultimately resulted in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who would go on to conquer much of Europe. Nevertheless, the French Revolution was a monumental event in world history. It was the first time that a nation of people had overthrown their government and established a republic based on the principles of democracy. The French Revolution was a watershed moment in world history. It was the first time that a nation of people had overthrown their government and established a republic based on the principles of democracy. So there you have it. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that emphasized the use of reason to challenge traditional authority. It began in the early 17th century and lasted until the end of the 18th century. The Enlightenment was a reaction against the religious fundamentalism and superstition that had dominated European thought for centuries. Enlightenment thinkers believed that the world could be understood through reason, and that human beings could use reason to improve themselves and society. This idea was revolutionary because it challenged the traditional view that humans were sinful creatures who should live in fear of God. Instead, Enlightenment thinkers argued that humans were rational beings who could make decisions about how to live their lives and how to govern themselves. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks for watching.